Scottish folk and fairy tales. The fairies of Scotland. The fairies of Scotland are represented as a diminutive race of beings of a mixed, rather dubious nature, capricious in their dispositions and mischievous in their resentment. They inhabit the interior of green hills, chiefly those of a conical form, in Gaelic called Shean, on which they lead their dances by moonlight, impressing upon the surface the marks of circles, which sometimes appear yellow and blasted, sometimes deep green in hue, and within which it is dangerous to sleep or to be found in after sunset. The removal of these large portions of turf, which thunderbolts seem sometimes scoop out of the ground with a singular regularity, have been ascribed to their agency. Cattle which are suddenly seized with a cramp or a similar disorder are said to be elf shot, and the approved cure is to chafe the parts affected with a blue bonnet, which it may be readily believed often restores the circulation. The triangular flints frequently found in Scotland, with which the ancient inhabitants probably barbed their shafts, are supposed to be the weapons of the fairy resentment, and are termed elf arrowheads. The rude brazen battle-axes of the ancients, commonly called celts, are also ascribed to their manufacture. But like the Gothic doer, their skill is not confined to the fabrications of arms. They are heard seditiously hammering in the linns, precipices, and rocky or cavernous situations, like the dwarfs of the mines mentioned by George. Agricola, they themselves, in imitating the actions of various employments of men. The Brook of Bowmont, for example, which passes in its course by the numerous linns and caverns, is notorious for being haunted by the fairies, and are perforated and rounded stones of which are formed a triterturation in its channel, and are termed by the vulgar fairy cups, and as dishes, fairy dishes. It's sometimes accounted unlucky to pass such places without performing a ceremony to avert the displeasure of the elves. There is upon the mountain top of Minchmer, the mountains within Peeblesshire, a spring called the Cheese Well, because anciently those who passed this way were wont to throw pieces of cheese into it as an offering to the fairies to whom it was consecrated. The usual dress of the fairies is green, though on the moors they have sometimes been observed in heath brown and weeds dyed with stone rot or lichen. They often ride in an invisible procession when their presence is discovered by shrill ringing of their bridles. And on these occasions they sometimes borrow mortal steeds, and when they are found at the morning panting and fatigued in their stalls, with their manes and tails dishevelled and entangled by grooms, I presume often find this convenient excuse for their situation, as the common belief of the elves quaffing the choicest liquor in the cellars of the rich might occasionally cloak the delinquency of an unfaithful butler. The Fairy and the Miller's Wife. One day, as the mother was sitting rocking her baby to sleep, she was surprised on looking up to see a lady of elegant and courtly demeanor, so unlike any she'd ever seen in this part of the country. Standing in the middle of the room, she had not heard anyone enter. Therefore, you may judge it was with little surprise and not unmingled curiosity that she rose to welcome this strange visitor. She handed her a chair, but was very politely declined to be seated. She was very magnificently attired, and her dress was of the richest green, embroidered round with spangles of gold, and on her head was a small coronet of pearls. The woman was still more surprised at her strange request. She asked in a rich musical voice if she would oblige her with a basin of oatmeal. The basin full to overflowing was immediately handed to her, for the woman's husband, being both a farmer and a miller, had plenty of meal at his command. The lady promised to return it, and named the day she would do so. One of the children put out her hand to get hold of the grand lady's spangles, but told her mother afterwards that she had felt nothing. The mother was afraid the child would lose the use of her hands, but no such calamity ensued. It would have been very ungrateful for her in her fairy majesty if she had struck the child powerless for touching her dress, if indeed the power were hers. But to return to our story. On the very day mentioned, the oatmeal was returned, not by the same lady, but by a curious little figure with a yelping voice. She was likewise dressed in green, and after handing the meal, she yelped out, "Bra meal," which means good in Scots, by the way. "Bra meal, it's the top pickle of your corn." It was excellent, and what was very strange, all the family were advised to partake of it, but one servant lad, who had spurned the fairies' meal and was dying shortly thereafter. The miller and his wife firmly believed it was because he refused to eat of her meal. They were also firmly believed their first visitor was no less than personages, the very person of the Queen of the Fairies, who, having dismissed her court, had not one maid in her honor waiting to obey her commands. The, a few nights after the strange visit, the miller was going to his bed, and a gentle tap was heard at the door. And on it being opened by him, with a light in his hand, there stood a little figure dressed in green, who, in a shrill voice, but with a very polite manner, requested him to let on the water and set the mill to order, for she was going to grind some corn. The miller dared not to refuse her, and so she did as she desired. She told him to go back to his bed again, and he would find all as he left it. He found everything in the morning, and as she said he would. So much is the honesty of the fairies.